Hello, and thank you so much for your time and attention today. Thank you to my colleagues at Catalyst for inviting me to give a few words to set the context for a variety of important conversations for my colleagues who are operating locally to advance the kind of change that we all want to see for San Diego and Imperial counties. It's my pleasure as President and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations to be with you, to share a little bit about our observations and point of view from a national perspective and connect it into the crux of what brings us here together. That's to imagine what it means to be all in for change. Right? I don't have to tell any of you, you already know that the context today is such that we're still emerging. We're just fighting our way through the emergence of almost 2 years now of a global pandemic, right? Health, economic, political. Suffice it to say, it's probably an understatement to say that so many of us have grappled with ambiguity, understanding what's next. How do we move forward? Certainly from philanthropy, the conversation involves how do we make the kind of impact that finally lives up to our collective aspirations for this sector. And how do we do so in such a way that responds to the conditions that the moment is requiring? This is our challenge. And so one way in which I tend to think about this, especially when introduced for the topic of being all in, I thought about how philanthropy has struggled mightily over the years, leading up to now, before now, and even beyond, perhaps, but struggling mightily with the challenge of responding to support the efforts of individuals and nonprofits who are leading the struggle for social equity, right? And why? This is to create the conditions for change that are more conducive to the thriving that we like to experience across the board, both locally and nationally. I want to invite you to consider, what does it require? What are these conditions for thriving about which I'm speaking that will move us closer to the type of experience on every level of civil society that we like to see? The first is that we want to be all in for change, right? But this is not as easy perhaps as it sounds. A lot of times we say we want to be all in. Like, yeah, we're all in, but what does this really mean? I would offer that we want to create the conditions that allow for the fullest expression of all people involved, right? This full expression. Some of you may have heard conversations recently about bringing our authentic selves. Perhaps for the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, this is really an invitation to not just bring your authentic voice, not just to find a space for your authentic expression, but to also find a space for your voice to be included in the decision-making process of the change that's happening within our community. So foundations, communities, grant makers, nonprofit service providers of all types, how might we create a welcome environment? Community as a space where all can come together to contribute to the kinds of decision-making that will translate into the quality of life that we all hope and aspire for together. This is the fulfillment of our collective aspiration. This is what it means to be all in for change. We also want to operate as a community. Community is a term that gets tossed around so much, but what we think about as GEO, our Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, when we talk about community, we're referring to a group of people committed to a shared set of values, a shared set of principles, even having a shared understanding of the experiences of the people who are closest to the work, across a set of issues, across a set of dynamics, but understanding how we're all situated and responding to each other with a sense of accountability, right? Building a sense of trust and rapport. And responding to the needs of each group, especially those that are most marginalized or excluded from the mainstream access, the best and the brightest opportunities to ensure that they have a meaningful connection to those resources. So operating as a community brings us closer to that vision for change that we want to see. And we want to reimagine what's possible, right? Reimagining what's possible is critical to creating the conditions within the communities that we serve in order to realize that shared quality of life on a global as well as local level. So easier said than done, some of you may be saying. For San Diego County and beyond, for Imperial counties and beyond, what do we need to know in order to do this? How do we facilitate the kind of change that I just described? I would say that there are 3 questions that are central to this question. However, the question itself is the way in which I encourage us all to approach this issue. So what do we need to know? First, we need to approach the issue. It serves us to approach the issue with an openness and curiosity for the people closest to the issues. In other words, we need to know, what is our shared experience of America's finest city, right? Who lives here? How are we situated? Under what conditions are we living here? Who works and visits here, right? Understanding how we are differently situated allows us to have a better sense of the types of resources required to arrive at the desired level of thriving that I described earlier, as well as how much is required. Right? So there's a particular understanding of the nuanced experience of those in community that's required to understand how we can be the most effective in our grant-making experience, the most effective in the allocation of resources, the most effective in understanding the types and amounts of resources required for thriving. Unfortunately, as many of you know, when we take a historical look at the conditions that have contributed to how we are today, which is another way of entering into a racial equity analysis, appreciating the differences between groups in order to raise the bar for all and close the gaps between us. The bar has been set too low. And what I mean by that is the conditions within the community, within our nation, were intentionally set at some point in history for the few to benefit from the hoarding of power, to benefit from what we might call the advantage, keeping advantage amongst a few and reinforcing or perpetuating disadvantage for a larger group, thereby marginalizing this group, separating them from access to resources and otherwise power, right? And because of the intentional creation of these types of systems, over time, conditions have continued to be perpetuated despite the original intent. So until we undo what has been done, we can't expect a different set of results to come from our actions. We have to take a structural approach. When we talk about systems change, we want to reimagine our social systems and institutions in order to structurally reshape, reallocate, reorganize our resources in such a way that contributes to the kind of thriving that we all want to see. We can do this. I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful for a very specific set of reasons. Why? Because one, we've seen examples all over the place. You'll hear from some amazing colleagues from San Diego and Imperial counties today to tell us about some of the activities that are going on that give us hope for change in our local communities. Nationally, we've seen colleagues across foundations, within government, across a variety of public and private sector partnerships that have taken this moment that has been characterized by so much uncertainty and made decisions that some of us thought weren't even possible, including being able to do what I believe will be an amazing and meaningful conference virtually with a very little time to learn how to do this. Right? It hasn't been long since we all came together to do these in person. And now we've developed a level of proficiency based upon our flexibility, our creativity, to respond to the moment with a different level of focus and a different level of impact. And so because we've been able to respond to these uncertain times that have a global impact, then far be it to me to believe that we're not capable of revisiting the traditional practices of our sector, revisiting the dynamics of the current structure of nonprofits, and identifying, reimagining a new way of moving forward that keeps our collective humanity central to the experience. So specifically, I'll offer 3 things that I believe we can do within this region to thrive. One is we want to always pay attention to how power is flowing. Are we building power? Are we hoarding power? Are we sharing power? Are we wielding or imposing our power in ways that we haven't checked with our peers, our colleagues, our loved ones across nations and industries to determine whether there's alignment for the end goal of our work? We want to cultivate relationships based on trust, because as some of you may know, it's been said that change happens at the speed of trust. And I'll offer that progress happens at the pace of change. And so within relationship, we pace ourselves. There's a rhythm, just like if a dance partner, you get into a particular rhythm, you don't jump right in there, or else you're stepping on each other's toes, we're bumping elbows, you're going left, I'm going right. Instead, we want to establish a rhythm of harmony, right? That's how trust is built. And then over time, we get into that rhythm and we're able to move farther, faster, but sometimes we have to move slower in the beginning to get there. And so we want to check in with each other. And based upon these relationships of trust, then we can start to establish a shared vision for America's finest city. We can also establish a shared vision for this nation. And so to conclude, I'd like to just offer to each of you, especially as I reflect back on our experiences at Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, the broad membership base of institutions that comprise our membership, there's so much reason for hope. We perhaps, if you're willing to consider this throughout the remainder of this time together as you listen to my colleagues, I invite you to consider that we may be the answers to the prevailing questions that characterize this moment. That the particular circumstances in this moment include the responses to these moments, the responses to these circumstances that reveal steps that we can take together if we tap into our collective genius for producing the kind of experience that's aligned across our organizations, our affiliations, or our identities. There's so much hope in the change that we've already been able to affect. And I invite you all to consider what else is possible, especially for our colleagues here, especially for our communities, especially for the people who live, love, and work in San Diego and Imperial counties. Thank you so much and enjoy the conference.